In the previous step, we created the calculate sum using data service method. The data for this comes from the data service, and we loop around the data and sum it up and give it back. Now, in this step, let's focus on writing a unit test for this, right? How do we write a unit test for this? Think about it. One of the approaches that we can use to write unit tests for this is to create a stub implementation, right? So we have a some data service. So I can create a stub implementation of this and use it to write a unit test. Let's explore that option in this specific video. And in subsequent videos, what we would do is we would discuss the advantages and disadvantages of this approach and then consider a mocking implementation. Let's get started now. What I'll do is I'll copy this same unit test. So some business test, I'll copy it, some business stub test. So let's rename the entire thing. So over here in the stub test, what I'll do is I'll start with the first one, right? So in the stub test, what we would want to write unit test for is the calculate sum using data service method. So this is the one which we would want to write the unit test for, calculate sum using data service. The other test we'll focus on a little later. For now, let's focus on this specific test, calculate sum using data service basic, right? So here we are creating an instance of business IMPL. We want to get the data from the data service. So how do we do that? So if I directly call the calculate sum using data service now, what would happen? What do you think will happen? I'll get a null pointer exception, right? So run as JUnit test. Null pointer exception because we are calling the sum data service. Before we are able to use the sum data service, we need to set it. How do we set it? That's where what we can do is say business dot set some data service and some data service. Typically, this data service IMPLs would be talking to a database. I don't want my unit test to be talking to a database, right? So if somebody is changing the data in the database, that's a problem. So your unit test should not be depending on anything outside. So how can I prevent that from happening? One of the things I can do is to create a stub implementation of the service. How do I create a stub implementation of the service? Let's create a simple one over here directly. So I'll say class some data service stub implements some data service. Cool, right? Does this compile? Nope. You need to actually first import it. Second, you need to implement the unimplemented methods. Now I can now say, okay, retrieve all data. What you can do is retrieve the data that we were actually putting in here. So it's 1, 2, 3. So I can say stub it to return new int of 1, 2, 3, isn't it? Now over here I can say instead of I can say new some data service stub. Awesome, isn't it? Let's see what would happen now. Right click, run as JUnit test. Cool, right? The test is running. We are running it with a stub. We created an awesome stub in here. This stub is returning the data. And now we wrote a unit test using a simple stub. Let's end this step in here. And I would recommend you to spend some time thinking what would be the disadvantages of this approach. What I would recommend you to do is, as an exercise, you can actually update these two tests. So these tests are still using calculate sum, right? So these are still talking to calculate sum. What we need to do is to update these tests to talk to calculate sum using data service. So I would want to use, instead of calculate sum, what we would want to do is to be able to do calculate sum using data service. Calculate sum using data service and calculate sum using data service over here as well. So if you run it right now, you would see that, oops, let's remove the parameters. That's not the problem actually. So, and I'll remove the parameter in here as well. Now, I would leave it as an exercise for you to try and update these two tests to retrieve the data using a stub. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye.